This afternoon, we're here to discuss a burning issue that's erupted to the centre of global attention. That is, what can workers and young people around the world do to stop the unfolding genocide in Gaza? My name is Oscar Grenfell. I'm a member of the SEP, and I'll be chairing this meeting. This is a hybrid event, so we have attendees here in Bankstown in Sydney. We also have participants tuning in on Zoom from across the country. We have people logged in from New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland, and the Northern Territory. So greetings to you. There are also members online from the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and participants in the Philippines. So a warm welcome. I'd like to thank those of you in attendance who are wearing a mask. We also have HEPA filters and far UVC lamps, all of which help to purify the oxygen that we're breathing and remove viruses from the air, including COVID-19. In this country and internationally, we're in the midst of a new surge of the coronavirus, which has already claimed the lives of millions of people over the past 4 years. The measures required to eliminate this virus and end the pandemic, such as those that we're using today, are well known. The issue is they've been rejected by governments because they could impact on profit-making activities. The SEP and our World Party have been alone in fighting for a program that places health and lives before profit, a position that we continue to advance. In terms of the format of the meeting today, we'll hear two reports and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. For those of you who are online, feel free to post questions and comments in the chat during the reports, and we'll get to them afterwards. I'll just make a couple of brief points in opening before introducing our speakers. The events of the past month are a turning point in world politics and history. Israel, an advanced industrial state, is carrying out the mass murder and ethnic cleansing of an entire oppressed population. More than 9,000 Palestinians have been murdered in less than 4 weeks, 40% of them children. Comparisons to the worst crimes of the 20th century, including the Holocaust, are entirely appropriate. The Netanyahu regime is taking the ethno-nationalist foundations of the Israeli state and 75 years of oppression to their logical conclusion. Hitler sought to eliminate European Jewry. Netanyahu is seeking to eliminate the Palestinians. As significant as the policies of Netanyahu is, the complete support for this genocide by all the imperialist governments, including in the US and here in Australia. By openly adopting the policy of the mass murder of civilians as part of their program, these governments are saying that there are no limits. There is no line that they will not cross. As our speakers will explain, this is completely bound up with their preparations for a world war and the capitalist agenda of a war against the working class in every country. What's become evident over the past month is that the governments, the official parties, and the mass media are on one side, that is the side of war, oppression, and mass murder, while workers and young people are on the other side. Millions of people all over the world have taken to the streets to express their shock, their outrage, and to demand an end to this genocide. In doing so, they've defied media and government lies and moves to ban the protests. Despite this, the movement is growing. Over this weekend, there were the largest worldwide protests since Israel began its onslaught. That included up to 250,000 people in Washington, DC, hundreds of thousands more across America, another massive rally in London, and substantial protests in every other European capital. In Australia, tens of thousands again took to the streets. Despite this, the protests have been subjected to an almost complete media blackout. So we wanted to play just a brief clip of some of the protests around the world now. They're a very significant mass movement that's developing. The attempts to suppress this movement, however, are continuing. They find a particularly sharp expression here at the university campuses. Last Thursday, our youth movement, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, came under a significant attack. Management told our club at Victoria University in Melbourne that we could not proceed with a meeting on campus next week about Gaza. We couldn't hand out leaflets opposing Israel's war crimes or raise the issue in any way. Doing so, they claimed, might make people feel unsafe. Now, we have to oppose these censorship measures. The clear aim is to silence the masses of people who will not accept genocide and who want to fight it. But the critical question is how that fight can be taken forward. Our publication, the World Socialist website, and our World Party have emphasised the burning need to mobilise the great power of the working class to stop this genocide. And we've stressed that the turn by the ruling elites to these crimes points to the need for workers to take up a new revolutionary political perspective. So to elaborate on these issues, our first speaker will be Boddy, the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP. Max writes for our website, the World Socialist website, and also plays a central role in developing the interventions of the SEP at university campuses, among young people, and in the working class. So welcome, Max.
Thank you, Comrade Oscar. What is being carried out against the Palestinians by the Netanyahu regime is a genocidal war. There are unending images on social media of neighbourhoods flattened, with hospitals, schools, places of refuge, and even impoverished refugee camps systematically targeted. The aim of this war is nothing short but the complete ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from Gaza through either outright slaughter or forced displacement. The Israeli government and military uses the language of extermination, describing the Palestinians as animals. What is being enacted is the culmination of the Zionist regime's final solution of the Palestinian question. In order to understand and grasp the full meaning of the horrific genocide and its backing by capitalist governments worldwide, it is necessary to understand the nature of Zionism and its historical emergence. The term anti-Semitism means a racist hostility to and prejudice against Jewish people. However, in the present situation, it has taken on an entirely new meaning. The Israeli regime, the ruling class of the world, and their supporters in the media and academia insist that anti-Zionism, that is, opposition to Israel and its reactionary nationalist ideology, is anti-Semitism. That is, to claim that Zionism is inseparable from the Jewish religion and ethnicity. This assertion, as a historical examination reveals, is a lie. But every lie plays a very definite social and political role, as so it does in this case. The claim that Zionism is equivalent to Judaism has become the ideological rallying cry for imperialist reaction around the world. It is used to back the Israeli genocide and to seek to ban and suppress demonstrations in support of the Palestinians. The aim is to crush democratic rights on the ground that any organised opposition to Israel's bombardment is akin to anti-Semitic hate speech. One must say, first of all, that the claim of the equivalence of Zionism with all its crimes and Judaism is a monstrous slander against the Jewish people. Zionism is not a religious movement, but a political one with a definite historical origin. The real issues, like all great questions in politics, can only be grasped and understood if they're dealt with historically. From its origins, the Zionist project was based on a reactionary ideology and program. It emerged in the aftermath of a series of pogroms violent riots aimed at ethnic cleansing against the Jewish population in Russia in 1881 to 1882. The Russian Tsarist regime was beset by a series of growing contradictions and launched a series of attacks on the Jewish population, and the term pogrom has its origins there. This has had a dramatic impact on Jewish thought. It escalated a turn by a significant section of Jewish youth and intellectuals towards socialism. They related the phenomena of anti-Semitism, which became increasingly virulent in the last decades of the 19th century, to capitalism. They saw the resolution to this phenomenon through the revolutionary transformation of society on a socialist program, and the oppression of the Jews could only be ended through the construction of a revolutionary leadership of the working class. The best representatives of the Jewish intelligentsia joined the revolutionary movement. This includes leading figures such as Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, and even stretching back to Karl Marx himself. Now, this did not go unnoticed by the ruling class in the West, who eagerly seized upon the rise of anti-Semitism in the East to use it as a political and ideological weapon against the emerging working class and socialist movement. Karl Lueger, who was a mayor of Vienna from 1897 to 1910, purposely exploited anti-Semitism to drive a wedge between the workers' movement and the discontented petty bourgeoisie. A keen student of Lueger was the young Adolf Hitler. One of Hitler's earliest biographers, Konrad Lieden, wrote of Hitler, and just to quote, it's on the screen, "The great light dawned on him. Suddenly the Jewish question became clear. The labour movement did not repel him because it was led by Jews. The Jews repelled him because they led the labour movement. But one thing is certain. It was not Rothschild, the capitalist, but Karl Marx, the socialist, who kindled Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism," end quote. Above all, Hitler's hatred of the labour movement was because it was based on internationalism and equality for all people. And to quote again, quote, "One of Hitler's most characteristic reproaches to the labour movement is that in Austria it had fought for equal rights for all to the detriment of the master race chosen by God," end quote. The use of pogroms and the growth of anti-Semitism was to produce another political movement, the establishment of Zionism, that is, the movement for a Jewish homeland, the foundation of which was laid by Theodor Herzl in 1897. It was founded on a deeply pessimistic and reactionary nationalist perspective, that anti-Semitism was not a product of society and therefore could be overcome by transforming society. Rather, that anti-Semitism was embodied in the very foundations of the human psyche and was a permanent and supra-historical, and had a permanent and supra-historical character and could not be ended. Critical to understanding Zionism is understanding that it directly opposed the international solidarity of the working class as the path to the liberation of the Jews. Instead, the movement sought allies with one reactionary power after another, as an open letter written in 1944 to a conference of the British Labour Party by Trotskyists in Palestine explained. Go through on screen again. Quote, "During its whole history, Zionism has always supported the reactionary forces of the world. Dr. Herzl, founder of Zionism, made a deal with the Tsarist minister Plever, organiser of the pogroms against the Jews of Kishinev, to the effect that the Zionist movement be used as a lever against the Jewish socialists, in return for which Plever would use his influence with the Turkish Sultan to obtain a charter for Zionism in Palestine, or on Palestine," end quote. The anti-socialist nature of Zionism was recognised by other imperialist reactionaries who saw it as an antidote to the international socialist movement. As the long-time servant of British imperialism, Winston Churchill said in 1920, quote, The struggle which is now beginning between the Zionists and the Bolshevik Jews is little less than a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people." End quote. The strategy of the Zionists in the first 40 years of the 20th century was to seek an alliance with British imperialism. As the Ottoman Empire was in the process of being shattered by the First World War, Zionism sought and obtained the declaration of the British Foreign Minister Balfour that Britain would support the establishment of a Zionist state in Palestine. From the very beginning, the establishment of a Zionist state, which would eventually become Israel, was only viable to the extent that it could serve imperialist interests as a non-Arab Jewish state in the Middle East. This was summed up very clearly by Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of the fascist wing of the Zionist movement. He presented the establishment of the Jewish ethno-state not as the fulfillment of Zionist aims, or not only, I should say, as the fulfillment of Zionist aims, but as the best means for the imperialist powers to protect their interests in the Middle East. And Jabotinsky pitched a Jewish state to the imperialists as a means of crushing the resistance of the Arab masses and ensuring continuing colonial domination. And just to quote, he said, "I need not dwell on the well-known truism of Palestine's importance from the viewpoint of British imperialist interests. I have only to add that its validity depends on one paramount condition, namely that Palestine should cease being an Arab country." And he continued later on and said, quote, "A Palestine predominantly Jewish, Palestine as a Jewish state, surrounded on all sides by Arab countries, which in the interests of its own preservation always seeks to lean upon some powerful empire, non-Arab and non-Mohammedan." End quote. This has been the perspective on which Zionism has rested, including its modern-day relationship with the United States, which is the global imperialist power. The establishment of Israel in 1848 was a tragedy not only for the Palestinians, but for the Jewish people as well. Its foundation was the direct result of the massive defeats of the working class in the 1920s and 30s by Stalinism and social democracy. To understand this critical period, we must return to one of the most significant events of world history, the Russian Revolution of October 1917, in which the working class, led by the Bolshevik Party, overthrew the capitalist provisional government and established the first workers' state. The strategic perspective and basis of the Russian Revolution was that it was to be the opening shot of the world's socialist revolution. The fate of the Soviet state in Russia depended upon the extension of the revolution beyond the border of Russia, above all in the advanced capitalist centres of Western Europe and North America. However, the Russian Revolution did not extend. This was not because the objective conditions did not exist for revolution in the advanced capitalist centres of Western Europe and North America. The decisive factor in the defeats of the revolutionary struggles of workers in the advanced capitalist countries was that a revolutionary party of a Bolshevik type did not exist or was only in the process of formation. This had a profound impact on the outcome of the struggles in Germany and Europe between 1918 and 1923, which ended in failure and counter-revolution. This meant that the first workers' state in Russia, which prior to the revolution was a backwards country with a majority peasant population, found itself isolated politically and economically. It was surrounded by hostile imperialist powers who backed a devastating 3-year civil war in the country. These factors contributed to the isolation of the Soviet Union and led to the emergence of a rising bureaucracy, an apparatus which found its leadership in Joseph Stalin. Stalinism was a nationalist backlash against the October Revolution. In 1924, he presented the perspective of socialism in one country, which was adopted by the Russian Communist Party. This was the complete opposite to the program of World Socialist Revolution. While Stalinism was victorious, it was not inevitable. There was a Marxist alternative. Had it been victorious, the world would have been a very different place today. The struggle between Trotskyism and Stalinism was the most consequential struggle of the 20th century, and one can say reaching into the 21st. This year marks the centenary of the founding of the left opposition, led by Leon Trotsky. Its founding document, the Declaration of the 46, was submitted to the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party on October 15, 1923. The primary struggle of the left opposition was a defence of socialist internationalism and the strategy of world socialist revolution. It fought against the reactionary nationalist anti-Marxism of Stalinism, which came to dominate the workers' movement on the false premise that it represented the continuity of the Russian Revolution. The issues that were fought out between these two political tendencies in the 1920s and 30s had a profound impact on the historical outcomes that determine conditions we still live in today. The defeat of Trotsky and the left opposition in Russia and the victory of Stalinism had a catastrophic impact on the outcome of the class struggle in Germany when, in 1933, the Nazi regime came to power. The victory of Hitler was not preordained. There existed a powerful working class movement that could have swept the fascists aside. Trotsky called for a united front of social democratic and communist parties, the two mass parties of the German working class, to defeat the Nazi Party. He warned that the victory of Nazism would be a global catastrophe, which would see the annihilation of the European Jewry. These warnings were ignored. The Stalinist Comintern refused to wage a fight against fascism, instead instigating an ultra-left turn, labelling social democracy as social fascists. This split the working class and allowed Hitler to come to power without a shot being fired. This was the greatest defeat of the working class in history. The Nazis then obliterated workers' organisations and placed their leaders and members in concentration camps. Zionism grew and developed because of this defeat. The smashing up of the German working class then led to World War II and the Holocaust, setting in train a series of events that function in the political situation today. With the victory of Hitler and fascism, without the victory of Hitler and fascism, there would never have been a mass Zionist movement or a mass migration of Jews to Palestine. In the previous period, most Jews were assimilationists. They wanted to enter society, not a Jewish homeland. In response to the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th century, they wanted to go to the US and to Canada, not to Palestine. The most politically conscious Jewish intellectuals, workers and students, they turned to the socialist movement, and at the time Zionism was a marginal political movement. However, the defeat in Germany changed all this. The horrors of the Holocaust, the mass displacement of the Jewish population, coupled with a political demoralisation and loss of confidence in the perspective of socialism, caused the reactionary perspective of Zionism to gain significant ground. Moreover, all the major capitalist powers who today claim to have a profound sympathy for all the Jews closed their borders during and following the Second World War. This blocked hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, resulting in many thousands perishing in concentration camps. But the Zionist project was to lead to a disaster for the Jewish people themselves, as Trotsky had warned of in 1940. It was a bloody trap, because whatever the attempts by left-wing Zionists to claim it has some kind of socialist coloration, it rested on two reactionary foundations. Firstly, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from their land by means of murder and terror. And secondly, by its open and increasing collaboration with imperialism as a garrison state in the Middle East, from where the supplies of oil in the post-World War II period became crucial. As the United States President Joe Biden put it recently, the US had made an investment in the state of Israel. Had it not emerged, it would have had to have been invented. The product of Israel's nationalist foundations and its role as the gendarme for imperialism has meant the Israeli state has been expansionist from its very establishment. You had the war against the Arab states in 1948, the Six-Day War of 1967 in which it annexed the West Bank, the massacres organised against Palestinian refugees in collaboration with right-wing Christian militias in Lebanon in 1982, the continuous expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and the war and bombardments of the Palestinians in Gaza. But the resistance of the Palestinians to this 75-year war has not been broken, and the crisis of the Israeli regime has deepened, marked by an ever-increasing shift to the right. It now rests upon the most right-wing Zionist adherents, many of them from the former Soviet Union, and personified in the fascist and criminal Netanyahu. Now the Israel regime, confronted by an ever-deepening political crisis, is reaching out for what can only be called its final solution. The removal, the murderous bombardment, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people recalls nothing less than the Holocaust, an industrial state carrying out mass murder of a people. The question must be asked, why is it that every imperialist capitalist government has lined up to support Israel? The answer is to be found in the situation that all of them confront, one of deepening hostility from the mass of the population and a growing movement of the working class. Zionism must be understood in its international context. It is the most virulent form of imperialist nationalism, which forms the basis in the final analysis of all capitalist governments. Capitalism is beset by crises on every front. You have the ravages of climate change, pandemics of which COVID is by no means the last, a deepening financial crisis, massive social opposition to an ever-widening social inequality, and above all, the steeper descent into war, as exemplified in the Ukraine, Gaza, and the attacks on China. In our understanding of the present situation, and above all, that of the Palestinians, we must go to the very root of the problem. It resides in the contradictions, now assuming ever sharper intensity, between the globally integrated character of the productive forces of capitalism and the historically outmoded and reactionary nation-state system. The defence of that system, which all capitalist governments see as being prosecuted by the Zionist state, must and will assume ever more barbaric form. Gaza tells us this. However, masses of workers and youth are entering onto the streets in their millions around the world opposing this genocide, and I think the video shown earlier makes that very clear. But what they require is a program and perspective that enables this movement to develop an understanding of its essential tasks. That is, the program of international socialism that animated and guided the October Revolution of 1917, opening the way for a new chapter in mankind's development. This perspective was carried forward by the left opposition and then the Fourth International, founded by Leon Trotsky in 1938, and which today is advanced only by the International Committee of the Fourth International, that is, our party. I encourage all of you attending today to strongly consider joining our movement and begin your critical education in these essential historical questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Our final speaker is Comrade Cheryl Crisp, the National Secretary of the SEP. Cheryl's been active in the Trotskyist movement for more than 50 years, fighting for a socialist perspective against war and oppression. So I'd ask you to join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thanks, Oscar. And I'd like to welcome everybody here today at what is I think, very important discussion. Let's remember the 21st century is not yet a quarter of its life old. and yet what characterises it is ongoing wars and continuous ones, each of which are more bloody and terrible than the last. We're now witnessing the greatest crisis since the end of World War II, with wars in Ukraine and Gaza. There are, I doubt, few who would not agree that the Ukraine war, the worst on European soil since World War II, is not one that is being waged by the United States and NATO against Russia. The US, at the same time, is now preparing war against Iran. It has deployed over 40,000 troops in the Middle East, along with a flotilla of warships. This has in no way reversed or even slowed the provocations and escalation of war preparations against China. Unless a movement of the international working class prevents it, we are seeing the first stages of World War III. The war in Gaza is certainly not the first of this century, but the level of brutality and barbarism is only comparable to that of World War II. What distinguishes Israel's assault against the Palestinians in Gaza is that, as an advanced industrial state, armed and weaponised to the teeth, it is undertaking the forced expulsion and extermination of an entire population. It can only recall the actions of the Nazis in World War II. The blocking of food, water, fuel, medicines, and electricity is a war crime. And while Netanyahu, Getz, Gallant, and their ilk are war criminals, so too is Biden, Macron, Sunak, Maloney, and all those, including Anthony Albanese, who have aided, funded, and supported the massacres taking place in Gaza. The strategy of the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence, articulating that of the National Unity Government in Israel, which includes all the opposition parties, is the forcible removal of over 2.3 million Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai Desert, to house them in tent cities and prevent them from ever returning to their homes in Gaza. The alternative, if that is refused, is death. This may appear the stuff of end-of-world movies, but the pulverisation of Gaza and its population by the Israeli forces is very real. The Israelis are armed, funded, and supported by the United States, NATO, and every imperialist power, including that of Australia and New Zealand. And they are done so under the rubric of Israel's right to defend itself. As of November the 4th, 9,485 Palestinians, almost 70% of whom are women and children, have been killed. This must be a warning. There is no red line over which imperialism will not step. Ambulances, hospitals, health centres, and over 200 schools have been destroyed. These are not collateral damage, but targets. Journalists are targets, with at least 36 killed. Healthcare workers are targets, with 135 killed. Bakeries and water sanitation units are targeted. In fact, anything that can destroy life for the population is being bombed. On Friday, the World Health Organization released a statement saying that women and children and newborn infants are, quote, bearing the burden of the escalation of hostilities in the occupied Palestine territory. 420 children are killed or injured every day, some of them only a few months old. The World Health Organization said that there are an estimated 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, with more than 180 giving birth every day. With 14 hospitals and 45 primary healthcare centres closed, some women are having to give birth in shelters, in their homes, in the streets amid rubble, or in overwhelmed healthcare facilities where sanitation is worsening and the risk of infection and medical complications is on the rise. When Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was asked by a reporter whether there was a threshold for the United States in terms of civilian casualties, his reply was, and I quote, "The answer is no. There is no limit." End quote. That is not just his personal opinion, but that of the Biden administration, and is being acted out by the Israeli regime. Israel has bombed the Jabalia refugee camp for the third day and has also bombed the Barouj refugee camp, which is south of the evacuation line, only confirming that the demand to clear the north of Gaza to a safe south was another lie by Israel. Gaza City is now surrounded by Israeli troops. Hospitals have run out of fuel, sanitation centres are running at 5%, clean water doesn't exist, and people are drinking out of puddles. Cholera and other infectious diseases will become rife. Calls by the Red Cross to enable the coordination of evacuation from Gaza City were rejected by Israel. Thousands of Palestinians who worked in Israel have been forced back into Gaza, and at least 4,000 have disappeared through mass detentions. The death toll on the West Bank continues to rise as settlers' attacks on Palestinians more than double. The classification of a war crime is not an epithet which is thrown around lightly. According to the Nuremberg Principles, which were the basis of the prosecutions of the Nazis after World War II, the definition of a war crime is, and I quote, "Violations of the laws or customs of war which include but are not limited to murder, ill-treatment or deportation to slave labour, or for any other purpose of civilian population of or in occupied territory. Murder or ill-treatment of prisoners of war or persons on the sea. Killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property, wanton destruction of cities, towns or villages, or devastation not just by military necessity." The definition of crimes against humanity read, and I quote, "Murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts done against any civilian population or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds when such acts are done or such persecutions are carried on in execution of or in connection with any crime against peace or any war crime. Leaders, organisers, instigators and accomplices participating in the formulation or execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the foregoing crimes are responsible for all acts performed by any persons in execution of such plan." That's gone. No country, anywhere in the world, adheres to these principles. That is now the situation in 2023. So why has this happened? And how should it be stopped? One thing has to be made clear is that this litany of war crimes was not in response to the October 7 uprising, an entirely legitimate, predictable and understandable uprising. It was used as a casus belli. It is clear that the preparations for the assault on Gaza was pre-planned, notwithstanding the surprise that clearly existed amongst the Israeli regime at the intensity of the October 7 uprising. That plan, that pre-planned preparation, is to rid Gaza and the West Bank of Palestinians. The very internal crisis of Israel itself, as one of the most unequal societies on earth, the growing opposition that exists within Israel by its own population to its dictatorial measures, and the attempt to wipe out all opposition to the interests of the United States in the Middle East, which includes Hezbollah and Iran. The horror that is unfolding before the eyes of millions throughout the world has come at a shock. The world has seemingly, for millions, transformed overnight. What in fact has happened is that reality has emerged. What is being witnessed is the real face of capitalism. That the state of Israel requires wholesale bloodshed and the extermination of the Palestinians to maintain its existence is a realisation being thrust on the world's population. But this is not a religious conflict. This is not one of Jew against Arab. It is that of capitalism that faces an existential crisis in terms of the economic, social and political relations against the working class. If Israel can only survive based on the extermination of an entire people, what has brought about this situation? Gaza is a battlefront that is repeated in Ukraine and being prepared in Asia against China. The perspective of US imperialism, along with the European bourgeoisie, is the redivision of the world. Colonialism has returned. The plunder and pillage of whole areas of the planet, whether it is on land, sea or outer space, whether of human, flora or fauna, is the perspective of imperialism because it is the only means by which it can survive. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 reprised the long-held perspective of US imperialism to regain that which had been lost in the 1917 Russian Revolution. While the restoration of capitalism at the expense of the Soviet population took place, it did not result for the United States in its capacity to exploit the unfettered resources that lay within the control of the Russian oligarchy represented by Putin. The redivision of the world in favour of the United States was a task to be completed, and because of the declining hegemony of US capitalism, it became an increasingly existential one. The targeting of Russia was aimed at dismembering the entire country, seizing and plundering its resources to reduce it to a semi-colonial state, thereby ensuring the United States would have a clear path to defeat China, which it sees as its main enemy. This is the task that US imperialism has harboured since 1917. While the United States emerged from the carnage of World War I, the dominant imperialist nation displacing Great Britain, it had the misfortune of rising to international prominence at the same time that the Russian working class, led by the Bolshevik Party, carried out its seizure of power. Lost to capitalism was 1/6 of the world's landmass. What it also did was demonstrated that the working class was in fact capable of overthrowing capitalism. As long as there was a leadership, a political party, a perspective, then that was a task which the Russian Revolution proved was possible. The restoration of capitalism in Russia in 1991 by the Stalinist bureaucracy was seized on as the means to rectify this situation and to resolve the growing crisis of US imperialism. This was being done in terms of its loss of hegemony internationally and the growing domestic crisis at home. Because the crisis of capitalism gripping every country, every imperialist country, can be resolved only through the violent domination of one imperialist rival at the expense of others. And this is possible only through war. Whether capitalist politicians want war or not is actually not the issue. It is being regarded as the least worst option. As was the case prior to World War II, in which they were incapable of preventing, so too is the case now. And so the question, and there is no question, that millions of people throughout the world are opposed and horrified by what is taking place before them. The response throughout the world, including amongst large sections of the Jewish people, have been opposition to Israel and to their own governments, who have all defended its genocidal slaughter of the Palestinian people. There is a growing awareness that this is not the position of, that this is the position of the political establishment as a whole. There is not a change of heart, there is not a change of direction by reshuffling personnel or parties through elections. They are all tarred with the same brush. The defence of capitalist property relations and the social conditions which arise from it at any expense. All governments are functioning as outright authoritarian or semi-dictatorial measures, which are always a feature of war. Protests in opposition to Israel's genocide are banned in Germany. They are in France, in Italy, in London, where 500,000 people protested last weekend. The media all but blacked it out. People in the United States who have organised protests have been pilloried and sacked from their jobs. In Australia, at least 2 universities have banned meetings on Palestine. As Oscar reported, at Victoria University in Melbourne, our youth movement, the IYSSE, has been told it can't hold its annual general meeting on Gaza without permission from the university administration. It has been told that we can't hand out leaflets opposing Israel's attack on Gaza. Our posters, which advertised our meeting that was going to be held on the situation in Gaza, have been removed and torn down by security. And we are being told what we can hold a meeting on at a university, which there was a time when universities were in fact places of discussion and dissent. No longer. These universities, these institutions have actually become a central pillar of the development of the military and measures to be used against the working class as a whole. And all this is being done on the premise that opposition to Israel and to Zionism is anti-Semitism. In fact, the real anti-Semites are the ones who have carried out this genocide in the name of all Jews. As it is becoming clear, there are many Jewish people who oppose what Israel is doing and refuse to allow it to be justified on the crimes of the Nazis. In fact, as this video shows, and these are Israeli police carrying out the suppression of anti-Zionist Jews in Jerusalem. As I said, this is not a religious conflict. These are class issues. These are class questions. It is that of capitalism, which faces an existential crisis in terms of its economic, social and political relations against the working class. And I have to insist, there is not one attitude to the Palestinians and another to the working class at home. In fact, the Albanese Labor government in this country is spearheading the war drive against China. And the fact that they are doing this has to be a very real warning to ordinary people in this country. Its leading role in AUKUS, which is the alliance organising war against China, means war against the working class at home. And that is what it's been doing since the election in 2022. The suppression of democratic rights is one prong of what is required for war. The allocation of $368 billion for the supply of nuclear-powered submarines is only the most reported element of the build-up of the military here. And I ask you, how is $368 billion to be paid for? The funds don't exist. They're not in the bank. They're not in their coffers. This will be extracted from the working class here through super exploitation of the working class, through wage cuts, the destruction of health, education and infrastructure. They're not using bombs, but the aim is the same. War abroad means war against the working class at home. And let's remember, the Labor Party in this country supported the State of Israel from 1948. There is, in fact, growing unanimity of life and the experiences of the international working class. Max has outlined the historical basis of the origins and history of Zionism, the complete dead end and bankruptcy of nationalism is expressed most sharply with the development of Zionism. But this is not a Jewish question alone. Nationalism in all its forms is an entirely bankrupt perspective, which has also led the Palestinians as well to a terrible disaster. And this is what every section of the working class must understand. The formation of the State of Israel was a catastrophe for the Palestinians, who were driven out of their homes, displaced, and then increasingly forced into what is an open-air prison. But it is also the terrible legacy of the nationalist perspective of their own leadership. The two-state perspective, which is now in tatters, was never viable. Two states, one arm to the teeth, dominating and oppressing the other, which it condemns to an impoverished and gutted state of affairs. How can such a solution be viable for the working class of either state? This state of affairs was overseen by the Palestinian Authority after the Oslo Accords brokered by US President Clinton in 1993. It is only through the unification of the Jewish and Palestinian working class that the conditions that confront both sections of workers can be resolved. There is undoubtedly, for all to see, a mass movement against war developing. Millions of people feel that they must take a stand. They feel that they can no longer sit on the sidelines. But protest will not stop the genocidal assault on the Palestinians, nor will it prevent the descent into world war. It didn't in 2003, when the largest protests ever held against the looming Iraq war, against the Bush administration. Millions of people worldwide demonstrated against that war, and they ignored it and it went ahead. Bush, Blair, Howard, all of them proceeded with the destruction of an entire society in Iraq, a price which the Iraqi working class is still paying. The protests which are being held today and are developing, are growing, are not being organised by the trade unions. They're not being organised by Labor. They're not being organised by the Stalinist-led organisations anywhere. They have been organised on social media, which itself has been the source of the coverage and the reporting of the situation in Gaza. There is one force, and only one force, that can prevent war, and that is the international working class. The 4 decades of the suppression of the class struggle is over. Workers throughout the world, faced with impossible working and living conditions through inflation, are now in struggle to claw back the decades in which their conditions have been eroded and destroyed. They are finding that to achieve this, they come into direct conflict with their union leaderships and the old political parties to whom they had turned. These organisations function as the direct policemen for corporations and governments. Palestinian unions have called on workers to block the handling of war material for Israel. This has been taken up by Belgian workers, and as we reported yesterday on the World Socialist website, workers at the port of Oakland in California responded positively to the appeal by Oakland Arab organisations to prevent the sailing of an Israeli ship carrying war cargo. This must be taken up internationally. The Socialist Equality Party, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, support working class action to stop the shipment of any items to Israel that could have any conceivable military use. The massive social power of the international working class must be mobilised in a political general strike to shut down production and stop this genocide. Our comrades on Friday attended a meeting organised by the Stalinist-run Maritime Union of Australia in Sydney and raised this very question. The response was to hound them out of the meeting and threaten them physically. When our comrades asked the MUA leadership, what are you organising in terms of stoppages, suppression of handling of Israeli goods, it was ignored. The answer was in the attempt to throw our comrades down the stairs. As I say, the fight for the unity of the working class will be undertaken in opposition to the present nationalist leaderships of the trade unions. That struggle must be developed independently through the development of rank and file committees in factories, workplaces, communities and neighbourhoods. The working class has already paid a dear price for the betrayals of working class leadership, and those experiences, the lessons, the history of it, has to be embedded in the consciousness of all workers and young people. In fact, as Max said, the betrayals of working class leadership are directly linked to the situation in Gaza about which we are discussing. It was not inevitable that Jews, following the horrors of the Nazi program of extermination during World War II, formed a racialist, exclusivist and oppressive national formation. It was the result of the defeats of the working class, as the result of the betrayals of Stalinism, which reached its most tragic and consequential form in the victory of Hitler and the Nazis. There was only one tendency that opposed the political positions of the bureaucracy, of Stalinism, and that was Leon Trotsky and the left opposition. Stalinism was not the inevitable outcome of the Russian Revolution. In order to establish the basis of the bureaucracy, its continued existence, it carried out the slaughter of Bolsheviks in Russia. In fact, the very forces who led the Russian Revolution found themselves in the Lubyanka and being shot by the Stalinist secret police. The question of whether there was an alternative to Stalinism was answered in the affirmative by the formation of the left opposition and then the Fourth International, of which our movement, the International Committee, is the expression of. Mankind has reached a point in its development of the productive forces, which is a turning point. While capitalism exists, the danger of world war exists. Capitalism will always find a way to resolve its problems. There is no final crisis of capitalism, whether it is in the capacity of the planet to support life, that will be answered by the independent action of the working class. Whether the new and rising generations of the world will have a world in which to grow and develop will be bound up by the decisions which people in this meeting and throughout the world make. For a capitalist class, a world without capitalism is a world that is not worth defending. So the existence of nuclear weapons and their use might not be their first choice, but it will be their last. The only perspective which is based on the interests of the international working class and rural poor is that of a socialist society. What is socialism, you could ask? It is one in which production is owned and organised on the basis of the interests of society as a whole, not for the tiny minority, the few to gain in terms of wealth. That society is planned by those who create the wealth of society, and that is the working class. It is planned not for profit, but for all, for the benefit of all. It is the only viable and progressive alternative to the hell on earth that capitalism has created for increasing sections of the world's population. But it must be fought for on the basis of a conscious international revolutionary perspective. It is ordinary people, workers, young people and professionals who must take up this challenge. There's not someone else, it is up to us. The voting out of one party in elections for their twin in opposition is bankrupt, it's futile, it's gone. No one else but ourselves can resolve the impasse that capitalism has brought the world to. Young people, workers and others must study the lessons of history, the struggles of the working class, its strategic experiences, and that of our movement as the basis for the building of the International Committee of the Fourth International as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. We urge you, make up your mind, make the decision to join our movement, become part of a world movement for the overthrow of capitalism. There is not unlimited time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Comrade Cheryl, for those remarks. I think the two reports have raised many issues, from what's taking place on the ground in Gaza to the historical roots of this situation, the broader context and the political perspective that we're advancing. I'm sure the reports have provoked questions, so we'd welcome you here to raise your hand and pose any questions that you may have. We're also taking questions online, so if you wish to raise something, post it in the chat and we'll read it out. Are there any questions that people wanted to raise here? I know that we have one question online which I can read out. It's, what does the SEP think about the boycott of products that support Israel Zionism? I think consumer boycotts is being raised there. Are there questions here in the room? While we're thinking about it, we do have a video we wanted to play. Just a few quick comments that we've collected from workers, young people at protests around the world. Our publication is alone in giving the sentiments of animating these demonstrations a voice. So maybe we'll just play that.
Whenever there's occupation, you can expect the resistance to form. Even before Hamas was created, Fatah was resisting.
What do you think about the role of the Western governments, like Biden going to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv meeting with Netanyahu, Albanese here?
Yeah, if it feels like they have ulterior motives because they're trying to escalate it more, I don't think them bombing hospitals, churches and mosques is trying to calm the situation down.
Apart from the destruction of the actual buildings themselves, there's no water, there's no electricity, people are performing surgery without anesthesia, medics are being killed and directly targeted, ambulance workers, pretty much every type of healthcare worker is being killed along with the civilians. There are pregnant people, there are people on life support, there are premature babies who were born during this recent escalation and conflict. None of them can evacuate as they've been ordered, and even when they do, they get bombed on the evacuation routes. Well, I mean, all of the acts I've listed here are classified as war crimes. I think it's not really something that can be argued, it's a fact.
As a Jewish person myself, I feel really passionate about standing up against something that is generally, they say, being done like in our name.
Biden has said that there are no red lines that he's going to lay down for Israel. So what do you think that means? What's your response to that?
I think that's horrible, and that, you know, the state of Israel is committing war crimes, and that the U.S. is going to condone that and not try to stop it.
Zionism is and always has been an anti-Semitic ideology. We want to live in peace and security with Palestinians.
What do you think can stop this now?
I think we need to mobilize mass public support in the U.S. That's what we need to do, because the U.S. is funding and propping up the Zionist project and has been for decades.
I voted Democrat and for President Biden, and I don't think I will be going forward that way. Workers of the whole world need to unite and have each other's backs, because those above us are not going to do that for us. History has shown that.
When you know something is wrong, you've got to stand up against it. You have to say no to people trying to take other people's lands, people trying to do it illegally, committing war crimes. You know, it's up to the people now. It's not up to the people in power anymore.
We've all seen the genocide that is happening, the genocide that is unfortunately Britain supporting, America supporting, France is supporting, and it's heartbreaking to see capitalism and nationalism is the disease. That's what's led to what we're seeing today. So I agree with that 100%.
Israeli people need to stand up to their government. Americans need to stand up to our government. We all have to stand up to these governments that are really destroying lives and not supporting people enough. Like, we have homeless people. We have so many issues going on here, and we're spending billions on war, and that's all these countries, these politicians care about. They're not reflecting the people, they're reflecting businesses.
The Organization of Palestinian Trade Unions has called on workers throughout the world to support, to take strike action to oppose the war, to shut down any shipments of weapons that are going to Israel, and to strike against the American government. What do you think about that call?
That is a great call. That needs to happen now, because the more we send them weapons, the more kids die, the more civilians die.
Okay, we have a couple more questions online. How could someone find out if a ship is sailing to Israel from an Australian port? It's another question asking our speakers to outline the disruptive role that the likes of the DSA, Socialist Alternative and the pseudo-left play in attempting to disrupt the growth of a real working class action? We have those questions. Are there any others here? Yep.
What has been the response of the Arab bourgeoisie? It's important to clarify that. Today, a massacre in Gaza.
Yeah. Which are you speaking about, a particular country?
No,
or?
Arab bourgeoisie and the Middle East bourgeoisie. And what is the response of bourgeoisie there with regard to massacre in Gaza? We have to clarify that.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on public disobedience and walking out from workplaces to cause economic harm to the capitalist machine? Because what are your thoughts on that, and how to practically move in that direction?
Okay. Well, there's a number of questions there, all on a similar theme. Do we want to take some responses now? Would you like to make some points?
Thank you for those questions. I'll make some initial points. The first question was on the question of boycotting of products. I mean, I think the real critical question is the necessary intervention of the working class. I mean, one could ask the question, how long is a piece of string when you talk about the individual boycotting corporations, boycotting governments? I mean, one still exists under capitalism. But the essential revolutionary force in society is the working class. As I think Comrade Cheryl outlined very powerfully, the essential question is the intervention of the working class consciously, including in the stopping of ports. I mean, the second question is, how could one find out about a ship sailing to Israel from Australia? I mean, workers would know. You know, workers who work the ports would know. They have to, take up a fight to block these weapons of death being moved and resources to facilitate this genocide back and forth between Australia ports. And if there's any conception that there hasn't been weaponry sent to Gaza, well, that's already been blown out of the water. It's a very secretive process in Australia, but I believe it was in the last 6 years, 322, I think it was a Greens MP said, forms of assistance, military aid had been sent. So this is a process that is undertaken here. And I mean, in relation to the question of workers taking action, I mean, we fully support that. But the critical question is to break with the leadership, the union leadership that is preventing that type of strike action. I mean, I think the experience that Cheryl went through in her report when we went to this MUA sponsored event of trade unionists against Palestine, in which we raised just a very simple question to the union leader, Paul Keating, of the MUA Sydney branch, which was, are you going to call for strike action of port workers? Are you going to organise political strikes across the country in opposition to this genocide? Not only was our question not answered, we were quite clearly told in no uncertain terms we can't be there, and frog marched out. That is the role that the trade union leadership played, but also the role, and this goes to another question, of the pseudo-left. That's what pseudo-left, fake socialists. These are layers who speak not for the working class, but for a privileged layer of the upper middle class. So the working class needs to take action. We call for workers to form independent rank and file committees in their workplaces to organise and discuss action that they need to take. We have sponsored and have the development and the creation of rank and file committees amongst postal workers, amongst health workers and teachers, as well as pathology workers. And we are calling, and we'll be organising meetings amongst them to very much call for not just simply the question of, putting through resolutions, which are critical, but taking political action, which is, I think, the essential question that this comes to when it comes to the question of how to stop this barbarism. But I'll leave it at that and we can discuss it some more.
Okay, I think Mike Head, a leading member of the SEP and a reporter for our website, wanted to make some points on the role of the Arab bourgeoisie.
Yeah, look, it's an important question that was raised. and it does go to the class questions in the Middle East, as it does internationally. The Zionists and their imperialist backers could not do what they're doing. They could not carry out their barbarism, their massacres, as they have been for decades, actually, against the Palestinians, without the complicity of the Arab and regional bourgeois regimes, who all have their own interests in working alongside or in support of imperialism against their own masses. I mean, we could have shown on the screen at this meeting, there's been huge protests across the Middle East among the population, including in Jordan, including in Egypt, including in Turkey, and including in Iran. And yet these regimes are all collaborating with the United States in one form or another. I mean, it's most blatant in the case of, Sisi, the dictator, the military dictator Sisi in Egypt, who has kept, people imprisoned in Gaza, working alongside the Zionist regime. It's particularly blatant, of course, in the case of King Jordan, the King of Jordan. They all know that they're sitting on a tinderbox domestically. There is huge outrage, opposition, anger, frustration. The same goes for the situation in Lebanon. So that in itself, I think, helps clarify the historical issues that are at stake here. This, as our speakers have emphasised, both Cheryl and Max emphasised, this is not a religious question. It's not in that sense, an ethnic question. It's not Jews versus Arabs. It's the working class against the capitalist national regimes. One could go back in history. Max went through the history of the development of Zionism, which only developed as an adjunct, of imperialism and profiting from the Holocaust, without which it would have been a completely marginal movement. But it's also been the result of the acceptance of the creation of the Zionist state by the Arab bourgeois regimes throughout the region. And they all have their own relations with the United States. They get enormous military and financial assistance from the United States. I think, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but I think the Egyptian regime even gets more than the Israeli regime. The King of Jordan gets enormous assistance from the United States, and so on. And, we've pointed out, even with regard to Hamas, insofar as Hamas, and the same goes for Hezbollah, insofar as they are dependent on the support from one or other of these bourgeois regimes, that also, completely conditions their response. I won't go into the whole history now of the rise of, the Islamist movements, but they have also been the result of the bankruptcy of the bourgeois nationalist outlook, also of the PLO, which, as our speakers emphasised, recognised Israel and in the Oslo Accords pronounced the two-state solution, which itself is a reactionary solution. Two states based on a so-called ethnic divide of the Arab and Jewish masses. It itself is a completely bankrupt and indeed reactionary proposal. Of course, it's become increasingly unviable as well. So the perspective that we fight for, that the Fourth International has fought for, we opposed the formation of Israel right from the beginning in 1948. We said, as Trotsky said, it was a trap, a bloody trap for the Jews themselves. The only answer in the Middle East is a unified struggle of the Arab and Jewish working class, the establishment of a socialist federation throughout the entire region. Now, that is not a utopian perspective. It's not an impossible perspective. Absolutely not. What's now being revealed in the Middle East shows a necessity for it. And we're fighting to develop, to the maximum we can, the movement of the working class in the imperialist centres like ours, and as well in the region against the Zionist regime and against American imperialism. So I just think, again, one has to go back to history and to understand the fundamentally bankrupt and reactionary nature of nationalism, the division of the world into rival capitalist nation states, by imperialism and by its accomplices, in the various regimes that it supports throughout the Middle East. So that's why our perspective, of international socialist perspective, is the only viable. It's the only realistic perspective to put an end to this, to the plunge into barbarism that we're now seeing. I'll just make those points for now.
There are numbers of other questions on the issue of mobilising the working class. There's one, how can we mobilise Australian workers to strike in solidarity with Palestine? There are concerns that Australian trade unions are pro-Zionist and will not support non-industrial strikes, but government will only listen if we can disrupt their capital production as workers. There's a question as to whether delegations can be sent to workplaces to raise the issue of a general political strike to stop the genocide. Did you want to make some points about that?
The perspective which I think I outlined in my contribution is the fight for rank and file committees. We are fighting to develop independent organisations, independent of the unions, I think, or the union leadership. What has become very self-evident for many sections of workers who have fought in terms of the development of strike action over enterprise agreements, for wage increases. This is under conditions of anything up to 6 and 7% inflation, 12, I think it is, interest rate increases. There was a report that in August, 12% of people with mortgages could not pay their mortgage. The situation in this country is becoming impossible. People can't afford rents. Rents are increasing by anything up to 10, 15, 20, 25% and more. The conditions of life amongst all sections of the working class is increasingly impossible to function. Now, the role that the union leadership has played is continuously to tie workers' struggles to the wage rises which governments, which corporations are putting forward on the basis that there's no money, that they can't afford it, all of which is patently untrue. There's a huge amount of money. It's just that it's not going to workers. It's not going to the working class. It's being spent on military, on stage 3 tax cuts, which are the largest sections of tax cuts that have ever been presented to the rich in decades. Now, what workers themselves are discovering is that they're being shackled by their very leaderships of their very own organisations. What do the union leaders say? You can't go on strike because there's anti-strike laws. And yes, there are. Who agreed to those anti-strike laws? The unions, because they are the mechanism whereby workers are enforced to accept without any sort of action what is put forward. It's not that there is agreement amongst workers for those conditions, but they see no alternative. What we are fighting to do is to develop an alternative organisational and political formation for the working class, and that is rank and file committees. We have steering committees at the moment in education. The Committee for Public Education is a group of workers who work in the education sector, not certainly in Victoria, in New South Wales, but more broadly. We can put you in touch with them. We have workers in the postal services, in the health services, in logistics. But what we have to do, workers need to contact us, and we need to develop and strengthen those organisations. Those workers who are not in these industries, contact us. Come in, speak to us, and we will fight to organise these rank and file committees. If there's workers anywhere who want to fight, we will assist, and we will organise and discuss with you the mechanisms by which that can be carried through. But the lesson that workers have got to develop their own formations, and in so doing begin to understand the nature of their own strength, their own capacities, which are profound. And the International Workers' Alliance for Rank and File Committees, which is the umbrella organisation of the International Committee, is an international organisation. We will put you in touch with workers in your industry internationally, because that is the mechanism whereby workers can really develop the forms, the capacity to have democratic discussions, to have verifiable and honest information, in order that workers can carry through these struggles. So I would very much urge you, contact us, contact anyone that you're in touch with in the SEP, and we will assist you.
Thanks, Cheryl. We'd now like to raise a collection for the monthly fund of the SEP. Every month, our party raises the resources that it needs to function from workers, young people and students. Certainly we get offered no support from governments or the corporations, and we wouldn't accept it if any such support was offered. We're a party of the working class. That's why we can hold meetings such as this, opposing the lies and the propaganda of the ruling elites and advancing a genuine revolutionary alternative. Now, under conditions of these momentous developments, it's really crucial that we expand our work at the universities, the workplaces, and in working class suburbs. Everything from the printing of leaflets to the release of books, the daily publication of the WSWS requires resources. So I'd ask you to donate as generously as you can. We'll have people circulating in the audience who can collect either a pledge or cash. You can also indicate. Online what you can pay. Just a reminder that if you're outside of Australia, due to anti-democratic laws, you're not allowed to donate to the SEP. You can instead donate to the WSWS. I think we probably have time for a couple of more questions, which have been coming in online. Is there anything else in the room? Yep.
Yeah, sort of extended thoughts I've been having. For one, I'm not sure to the extent that we can actually hypothesize, but I think when you ask the question cui bono about these attacks, as it was pointed out, Netanyahu was facing massive legal problems, facing jail, in fact, and a huge political crisis with the mass protests against him. And then, Israel being, for anyone who's familiar with the development of surveillance technology, of facial recognition and AI, it is the most advanced surveillance state in the world, and Gaza had to be the most surveilled, not a border, but a fence, the most surveilled part of that. The fact that, just years before, if a child approached the fence line, they would be shot down by snipers. And then on this morning of October 7th, thousands of people poured across the border at multiple points and faced no real resistance for 8 hours. I find that just gobsmacking. Several IDF members have already raised points that was, in various places that territorial soldiers were disarmed beforehand, and so on.
Yeah, there is quite a similar question online. I mean, it raises how credible is it that the Hamas attack on October 7 was unknown by Israel? All right, so I think Nick is able to speak now, is that right?
There was a question raised about the role of the DSA. I mean, it would take longer than the time we have available to go into all of it. I'll just focus on one of its most prominent members, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In October 18th, our report explains that she explicitly, in an interview on CNN, backed the funding for the so-called Iron Dome, which allows Israeli Defense Forces to conduct, as we reported, unlimited airstrikes on Gaza without any fear of retaliation by rocket attacks from Hamas or other armed Palestinian groups. And she has now lined up completely behind this. She has already given her endorsement. I mean, the DSA postulates or presents itself or tries to present itself as some kind of socialist opposition. Its primary political role is to divert opposition in and behind the Democratic Party with the illusion that somehow this party can be pressured. AOC has directly backed already Joe Biden, Genocide Joe, as he's now called, for the US presidency. She has also earlier said that pro-Palestinian demonstrations should be shut down. It should not be so hard, she said, to shut down hatred and anti-Semitism when we see it. In other words, repeating the big lie, as Max went through, that opposition to Zionism is opposition to Jews and anti-Semitism. So the pseudo-left, the DSA, their counterparts all around the world, are an integral part of the political operation which makes this war possible. And they do it. I want to raise a deeper question, because they play a very decisive political role in world politics. They are very central to what has been a theme of bourgeois politics, left politics for the past 40 years, which is the attack on the revolutionary role of the working class. They maintain it doesn't exist. The Russian Revolution is a thing of the past. The working class is not a revolutionary force. And of course, everywhere give their support in every country to the very same trade union apparatuses, which, as we have so graphically reported at this meeting, make possible this ongoing war and genocide with their support for imperialist governments. We were thrown out of the meeting because we are opposed to the Albanese government, and these bureaucracies are its principal prop, not only in the war preparations and the war developments, but in the suppression of the working class. That's what they're opposed to, and that's their role of this tendency. So their position is one of the prop for imperialism and its war crimes, and they play that role internationally. The Bernie Sanders, the so-called socialist candidate in 2016, has completely lined up behind the Biden administration on this question, and we have this phenomenon being repeated all around the world. Starmer in Britain, the head of the British Labour Party, Albanese in this country, but they only exist to the extent that they're kept in power, or they're propped up by these organisations which maintain that there's no alternative outside of either the Democratic Party in the United States, you must work through this, the Labour Party in Australia, and so on, and the support that they provide for the union bureaucracies. So that's just an example of their role. But I think there's a very deep question that's involved here that we have to really consider. As the speakers have outlined, and as many speakers on the videos explained, this is a policy of genocide. In the last week, really, you could say this has now become, or since this began, this is now being supported by every capitalist government around the world. This tells us world politics has changed in a fundamental direction. To call this genocide is not some rhetorical declaration. It's an expression of what is. That can only result from, be an expression of something very, very deep going problem in existing society. And it is the fundamental contradiction between the global character of society, of production, and the reactionary nation-state system, which is being exemplified in Gaza. When they say Israel has the right to defend itself by any means possible, by all means available, no holds barred, no red lines that cannot be crossed, it's a declaration by all the imperialist governments that this is what they'll do to defend this reactionary, outmoded nation-state system. So we confront a deep problem which requires deep thinking about its solution. Not superficial thinking, deep thinking. And that means historical thinking. That means an examination historically of how this situation has arisen. The answers to that are to be found in the most consequential struggle of the last century. That is the struggle of the left opposition, the Trotskyist movement, of the Fourth International, of the International Committee against nationalism. This is what we're fighting. They rally around Zionism because this is the most egregious expression of this nationalist, imperialist ideology which guides all of them. When they say Israel has the right to defend itself, they're talking about themselves. Defend themselves against whom? Against the working class, against which all means are possible and necessary. So I think this is the crucial question that has to be understood. The only perspective on which the working class and humanity can go forward is the perspective of world socialist revolution. That's not an abstract discussion. World War I was only ended when the opening shot of that world socialist revolution was fired in the Russian Revolution. World War III which has in some senses already begun, will only be brought to a halt by the return to that perspective. And that requires the active involvement, the active commitment of individuals to devote themselves to this struggle and, as our speakers have explained, to advance society, humanity, to a new level where human beings can actually live. And as Cheryl emphasised, we don't have much time. So I very much endorse the call that was made for everyone here and listening to consider most seriously joining the SEP, not some date in the future, but today. Join this global struggle, provide it with leadership, turn it to the working class, introduce into this struggle the fight for a socialist perspective. Leon Trotsky said in the outbreak of World War I, permanent revolution or a permanent slaughter. That is the situation which confronts mankind, and it confronts it today. So I endorse those comments very much and urge you to give the most urgent consideration to joining our party and build the World Party of Socialist Revolution. The only answer to the policy of genocide that has now been openly adopted by every capitalist government.
Thanks very much, Comrade Nick, for those important remarks. Just in bringing the discussion to a close, I'd like to point to several titles that our publishing house, Merring Books, offers, which are very directly relevant to this discussion. The first of those is Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century by David North, chairman of the WSWS International Editorial Board. Gives a very comprehensive explanation of why the legacy of Trotsky and his perspective of world socialist revolution is the only way forward for the working class today. That is available for $37 plus postage. We're also selling it as a bundle deal for $60 with this title, COVID, Capitalism and Class War, which reviews the response of our movement to the pandemic, the scientifically grounded program of elimination for which we've fought against the policy of herd immunity adopted by governments around the world. This title, A Quarter Century of War, is particularly relevant. It reviews the eruption of imperialist violence since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, outlines the geostrategic and economic motive forces of this, and puts forward a revolutionary anti-war perspective. That is $30. And finally, I'd encourage you to purchase the SEP Statement of Principles for $5. It outlines the essential principles of our movement and is the basis for membership. Just in concluding the meeting, I'd emphasise that this is not the end, it is the beginning. We're going to be taking this fight into the workplaces, holding future meetings on campuses and in the workplaces. So sign up, leave your details, speak to SEP members, and as comrades have emphasised, above all, consider joining this movement. Thank you very much.